A long night's playing. One day, not too long ago, a couple of strange and wild-looking characters were seen in the streets of Inverness. Both were dressed in the breachen, or plaid, the original and true Highland dress that is aped by the modern kilt. They were heading towards the town centre from the direction of Tomnahurich, the hill of the yew trees. Long a burial ground and associated for even longer with the fairies, Tomnahurich is just south of the centre of Inverness and overlooks the river. Some say the Queen of the Fairies holds court there, and others that Finn MacCool, the great Gaelic warrior hero, sleeps within the hill with his warriors, awaiting the day when they have to ride forth to save the country. At first, people merely gave quizzical looks to the two Highlanders, though some people noticed that the Gaelic they were speaking to each other was a little strange. It wasn't till they had come close to the centre of town and started shouting and kicking at cars that the police were called. It took half a dozen brawny Inverness policemen to take them into custody, for they were clearly angry and upset. However, none of the policemen could get much sense out of them, so they were assumed to be drunk and were thrown into a cell till the morning. Come the morning, they were brought up before the sheriff, who asked them what they thought they were up to. They just looked at him and at each other with clenched brows and gritted teeth. One of the clerks of the court approached the sheriff and whispered in his ear. He repeated his question to the two men, but this time in Gaelic. As soon as the sheriff started speaking Gaelic, both of the men started speaking at once, rushing to tell their story. "Wishit," said the sheriff, "just one at a time. You," he said, pointing to the man on the left of the dock. "You tell me what happened." The tale the man told was truly amazing. "We were on our way, sir, from Strathspey to play in the streets of Inverness when this old man stopped us on the road. He had seen our pipes and asked us if we would like to play for a dance. He said he would pay us a guinea each and as much ushkavea, whiskey, as we could drink. This was a fair offer, we thought, so we decided to play for the man. He took us inside Tomnahurich, honestly, sir, through a big door we hadn't seen before, and there was a great crowd of ladies and gentlemen ready for a dance. The whole place, a great big hall it was lit by candles, and they gave us a drink to start us off. We played through the night, sir, and come the morning, the man gave us our pay and we came to the town. But everything has changed, hasn't it, Donald?" he asked, turning to his friend in the dock beside him. Achone, I do not recognize the place at all hardly now," said his companion, with a frightened look in his eye. "You say this was just last night you played for the old man?" inquired the sheriff. "Aye, sir, it was just last night." "And did you get paid all right?" the sheriff continued. "Aye, we did," replied Donald. "A golden guinea each." The sheriff turned to the court to speak to the police sergeant sitting there. "Did you find any money on these men when you searched them?" he demanded. "No, sir," replied the sergeant, standing up and then immediately sitting down. "Excuse me, sir," said the first piper. "We weren't sure who these men were, so we hid the money." "Well, hand it over now," ordered the sheriff. The two Highlanders ducked briefly down into the dock before standing up again, each with a bright, shining guinea in his right hand. "Hand them over to that man there," said the sheriff, and the clerk of the court approached the dock. "And you, bring them to me." The two pipers did as they were told and handed the guinea over. But just as they left their hands, they turned to dust, and the clerk of the court was left with a palmful of nothing but fine dust, which started to blow into the air even though the court was perfectly still and without a draft. "There's something funny going on here," said the sheriff. "We need to find out what is happening. You are remanded in custody for further inquiries. Take them down." Two policemen came forward and took the pipers away with another half-dozen uniformed men in close attendance, just in case. The two pipers were led away, looking even more confused than before. They clearly had no idea what was happening to them. Once they were in their cell, they talked rapidly to each other for a few minutes, and then one of them came to the cell door and called to the policeman on duty. Luckily, he was a local man and spoke Gaelic. "Could you fetch us a priest?" Donald asked him. "We would very much like to see a priest." His fearful eyes and strange manner touched the constable's heart, and he went to get permission for a priest to be called. An hour or so later, a Gaelic-speaking Catholic priest arrived at the courthouse. He had been told there was something odd going on at the courthouse, but had been given few details. He was taken aback to be met in a police cell by two Highlanders dressed in traditional style, whose clothes appeared to be ancient indeed. They were so pleased to see him that both started speaking at once. They told him they had been at the Battle of Sheriffmuir just a week before, heading up to Inverness, and they had no idea what had happened to them. Were they in heaven? Or were they in hell? Or where were they? The priest was perplexed. Sheriffmuir had been fought in 1715, more than 200 years earlier. He decided they must be mad. but what kind of madness could affect two people in exactly the same way? He was at a loss as to what to do, so he got the Highlanders to kneel with him and began to pray. At the very moment he invoked the name of the Lord, something strange happened. The two men in plaids kneeling before him began to fade, and the two pipers turned to dust before his eyes. The fine dust swirled into the empty air, and within a minute there was no sign that the pipers had ever existed.
There's no such thing as coincidence. Keep telling the students that. You know?
Yeah. Speaking of things that you tell people, Stuart, I heard you say once, I heard you say something like, the winners write the history, but the losers never stop telling their stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's fundamental to understanding what culture is about, not even specific cultures, but all cultures. Because
Mm,
we live in a world that is dominated by, obviously, by literature. And the people that create literature, particularly those who want to tell you their version of what reality is, they are very often unaware of the fact that they themselves have very strong biases.
mm,
They have ways of understanding the world that's not necessarily the same for everybody else. And the tendency, unfortunately, within the whole of academia, it's changing slowly, is to think that anything that's just talked about is secondary or of very little interest. But in actual
mm,
fact, if you actually think about it, all human culture comes from small groups and goes upwards. Culture doesn't come down. Culture grows.
mm,
That's how it's grown. And I mean, I've been finding stories that I think are potentially thousands of years old that are still being told today that no one's ever
mm,
written. There's still stuff out there that people haven't gathered, because it's part of
mm,
living tradition. This is the thing about when the losers talk to each other. That's part of living tradition. And
mm,
it's very important in Scotland at the moment because of what we're going through politically.
mm. Well, this reminds me of something that you wrote in the introduction to this book. Maybe I'll even just read some of you to you if you don't mind me reading a little excerpt here.
Oh, it's absolutely
You wrote the material in this book comes from traditional tales that have in the main been written down over the past century or so. And then this is the key part that comes to my mind as you were just talking there. You say it is only recently that the role of storytelling has begun to be understood. While there has always been an awareness that the oral tradition contained remnants of ancient beliefs, it is now understood that in some cases, story can pass on hard facts over periods that can be as long as thousands of years. And then I don't know, Stuart, you yourself are a historian, and yet you're willing to say this. You say the historian's obsession with paper and dates has blinded us to the fact that oral transmission retains a great deal of what life was like for our ancestors and how they themselves saw the world they inhabited.
yeah.
That's exciting.
Well,
It's interesting.
it's because I mean, that was written 21 years ago. Now, I have
Mm.
a course called geomythography. Uh,
That word. Oh, I wanted to ask you about that word. Yeah, tell me about geomythography.
Geomythography, the term was invented by someone else to describe me at a conference about 10 years ago, I think. Because
To describe you, you say, at a conference?
I'm not,
That's okay. That's honestly.
I'm not
Mm.
Scotland's leading geomythographer. Um, I took this and I'll have that. Yeah, thank you very much. And basically,
Yeah.
what we do is, what I teach in that is that you look at place and you look at place through time, whereas historians are always trained to look almost stratigraphically. What's happening elsewhere? What's the big picture? Uh,
Mm.
whereas what I'm interested in is looking at what remnants of culture and cultural continuity can be found in place.
Mm.
And so I concentrate on places, and the material the amount of material that is there is absolutely it's incredible.
Mm.
I mean, I've put out two books. Well, one book's out already this year, but the other one's just finished. I've put two books out of this stuff, and there is just so much material that people, that's not true. They've not ignored it. They've not seen it
Mm.
because the the oral tradition reflects not just stories that are told, but it also reflects how place names come in. It's also
Mm.
it's also tied in with specific places in the landscape because all humans respond to landscape, and particular shapes create psychological resonances. And these in turn become involved with mythology and legend, and there's a kind of complicated interface between place name, landform, story, and song that
Mm.
leads into what actually becomes the culture of people in any place. You know, happens in cities.
That reminds me of hearing you tell a story. There was some sort of festival or something. There's a recording of it on the internet of you telling a story about a giantess who might have been one-legged, one-eyed, and one-toothed, who fell. She fell. Was it at the Mole of Kintyre? I think maybe.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, she affected the landscape. Right? Was part of the story there.
She's the kayak, and the book
Yeah.
come out. I was asked by an archaeologist to put together all of the material, or as much material as I could find about the kayak, and that book is just out. And the amount of material, and what we're looking at is remnants of belief in a
Mm.
goddess figure that predated Christianity. But of course, when Christianity comes in, it comes in with the book and the
Oh yeah, the written. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, a written down on pages kind of thing. Yeah.
and you go to the well, there it is. It's there in black and white. You've heard people say,
Yeah.
you know, oh, it's there in black and white. But the person that wrote that wasn't necessarily, you know, any better informed than you are or I am. But
Yeah.
it's written down. It has the stamp of authority, and
Mm.
that comes with the Christian religion and literature at the same time. Whereas what's there already has to adapt and adjust to that. But as I say, it carries on. There are stories that I know that are still told, that
Mm.
potentially date back thousands of years. And in Australia, we have absolute proof that some of the stories are 30 to 40,000 years old.
Yeah. My goodness.
You know, they actually talk
Well.
giant wombats and kangaroos that we've found fossils of. You know,
Ah. Yeah. The speaking of the geomythography theme, I was thinking maybe this episode being sort of Halloween themed after I doctor it up and everything, maybe we'll come in and you and I'll be talking after having heard a little reading from A Long Night's Playing, which has to do with a mound or a hill.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
there and there's I might be a little bit extra drawn to stories about mounds and hills because of sort of uh the culture that I've grown up in. There remains for some of us here a fascination with mound building people ever since Andrew
yeah,
Jackson.
absolutely.
Um and maybe that's a universal everywhere in the world. I don't know. Maybe we're all drawn to hills and mounds or to building hills and mounds or something like that. I don't know.
There's a whole load of psychological underplay to this. I don't know that it exists over your side of the duck pond, but here, a lot of the hills and mounds are tied up with the fact that they're breast shaped
Mm.
and are therefore representative of fertility and are therefore linking back to this ancient goddess belief. I don't want to call it a religion because I don't know enough about it, but
Mm.
the whole underlying idea of a feminine agency basically controlling the universe seems to be there in the landscape. And so we respond to mounds because everybody was subtle. You know, I mean, this it's part of who we are. You know,
Yeah.
uh, and the mounds, particularly the Scottish tradition, you've got mams, which are the older women who has suckled, and then you've got paps, which are the younger women who hasn't had a child. And
Mm.
they are different, but they're there in the landscape. And there's so much material tied up with it. And I think that if you look across the world, Kilimanjaro, Mount Fuji, uh, they're all this shit. It's a
Yeah.
universal thing.
Well, I don't live too far away from the Grand Teton mountain range here.
Yeah.
And, it maybe speaks to sort of the commercialism of today, maybe especially here in the United States, but I've heard the same theory about the golden arches of the McDonald's symbol that we're drawn to that in part.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Yeah, yeah. Well, people respond,
Yeah.
and this is one of the things about understanding the past is that if we are traveling about the countryside and we notice something, our attention,
Mhm.
that's been happening to people for as long as people have been around.
Mm.
We are not any different from our ancestors, and you know that trigger that makes you look at something, happen to people, you know, centuries.
I I think that's such a lovely insight, and it's maybe something that I should be embarrassed that it took me so long to think of it, but I think it was when I was listening to a telling of the Epic of Gilgamesh that it struck me just a few years ago that, like, this is such an old story, but these relationships and emotions are so real, like, they feel so relatable. These aren't, like, distant cavemen who I can't relate to, like, people have been people for such a long time.
The key to understanding all of this for me, right, actually goes back to 1974, standing in a pub, which I spent a lot of time in pubs and not always performing. Uh, and a friend of mine, who has since gone on to be a storyteller himself, told what we thought was a joke.
Mm,
Local joke, because it was in the local dialect of Scots. It was very, very urban. It was, it just absolutely fitted where it was. And then I came across a variation of the same theme a week later in a version initially gathered in Gaelic in 1834.
oh, wow.
It's the same story. And
Mm,
since then, I found it in the South Seas in Japan. It's a universal story.
huh,
What it adapted and changed and was alive, it was part of living culture. This is in 1974. It was alive and being told in the public. And at that point, I thought, this isn't antiquarianism, this is living culture. And it's understanding
mhm,
that it is living and dynamic and always changing is the key,
mm.
I think, to understand.
If you don't mind me trying to direct us into where I could cut in another story, Stuart, I'll cut in another one later, where we maybe could kind of round out the theme of hills and geomythology with another. Do you pronounce it Tamnahurik? Tamnahurik tale?
Yeah.
Mm. You have another tale about that same mound here, and I should mention too, we're talking about a specific section for sake of the holiday Halloween, a specific section of the Silver Chanter, which is Pipers and the Supernatural.
Yeah.
Another Tomnahurik tale. For many ages, the Queen of the Fairies made her home in Tomnahurik, and she ruled over her subjects with an iron will. What she wanted, she would have, and such were her magic powers that no fairy ever thought to question her. From the fairy realm inside Tomnahurik, she could spy on humans over a vast distance. One day she happened to notice Angus Moore, a young piper who had come to Inverness from Westeros to make a name for himself. Now Angus was a fine piper indeed, and he was also tall and handsome, and a very fine dancer. He turned the heads of young and not so young women wherever he went. He was also known to be honest and open-hearted, friendly and helpful to all. The Queen of the Fairies took a shine to him and sent two of her guards out into the human world to bring him to her. Angus was sitting outside his own door on the outskirts of Inverness when two well-dressed gentlemen came up to him. "Are you Angus Moore the Piper?" one of them asked. "Aye, that I am," replied Angus, eyeing the two strangers. Whoever they were not poor. Their clothes were of fine workmanship, and their shoes looked very expensive indeed. "Well, we have heard that you're a grand piper indeed," said the second man. "It's very kind of you to say so," Angus said. "What can I do for you?" "Well," said the first one, "our mistress is a great lady. She is holding a dance nearby tonight, and she would like you to come and play for her. If you are happy to do so, we will come and pick you up at 8 o'clock tonight. She said you can have double your normal fee." Now Angus wasn't a greedy man, but double wages were not something to be ignored, so he agreed that the two men could come and collect him later that night. It wasn't till they had gone that he realized they had given him neither their mistress's name nor the place he was going to be playing. Never mind, he thought, this should be a good night's work. At precisely 8 o'clock, the two strangers arrived to take Angus to the ball. Off they went, and pretty soon Angus realized they were heading for Tomnahurich. Like everyone else in the Highlands, he knew the reputation of the place and realized that his companions were not human. He figured out they must want him to play for the fairies to dance. But he was a courageous man, and was curious to see what the fairy ball would be like. When they got to the fairy hill and he saw the great door begin to swing open, his curiosity was sparked even further. He also realized that if he turned to run, there was no knowing what the two fairies would do to him. On they went, and there, seated on her throne amongst thousands of magically garbed fairies, was the queen of the fairies. Tall and beautiful, she was unlike anything he had ever seen. "Welcome, Angus More," she said, beckoning him to come and sit beside her. "Welcome, and welcome again. You are thrice welcome." Angus was overwhelmed by the power and beauty of this fabulous creature, and sat in the throne alongside her, looking at her beautiful pale face, long neck, rippling black hair, and smooth shoulders. "Now, Angus, I must tell you that I had you brought here because I have fallen in love with you. Your good looks, your great piping, and your warm heart make you a prince amongst men. I want you to stay here with me and become my consort. You shall want for nothing that the human or the fairy worlds can give you." Angus's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The queen of the fairies wanted him to be her partner. This was fantastic. But Angus was a good man at heart, and knew what he must do. "Your Majesty," he stuttered, "that cannot be. I have a wife and a child already back in Inverness, and I cannot abandon them." He saw at once that a steely glint came into the queen's eyes as she looked at him. He could feel the tension in the air. How could anyone refuse the queen of the fairies? Suddenly, he sprang to his feet, pulled out the skin-dew from his stocking top, and pointed it at the queen. All the fairies flinched away at the sight of the cold steel. They have never had any power over things of iron and steel, and this causes them to be greatly afraid of such things. Holding the little knife close to the queen's throat, he got round behind her and moved her towards the door. "Open the door, or your queen dies," he roared at the top of his voice. In truth, he didn't know if he could harm the queen, but he had to get the door open somehow. Suddenly, with no move from anyone he could see, he felt fresh air on his back. The door was open. He immediately threw himself backwards through the door, waving the knife about him as he did so. He came through the door and tumbled down the side of the hill. As soon as he found his feet, he was in a defensive stance, his pipes clutched under his left arm and his right hand moving about before him, waving the knife. There was no sign of the door he had just come through, or of anyone, human or fairy, there on the slopes of Tomnahurich. He had a narrow escape, but he knew that the fairies could be vindictive, and he ran all the way home to his family. When he got there, no one was about. His wife and child were gone, with a pot of food still bubbling on the fire and a chair lying on its side on the floor. The queen of the fairies had stolen them away. Angus felt as if his heart would break, and he knelt there on the floor of his wee cottage, sobbing uncontrollably. How could he ever hope to get his beautiful wife and child back from the all-powerful queen of the fairies? Maybe he would have to give himself up and do what the fey creature wanted. As he sat there in the deepening night by the firelight, he decided that his only course of action was to go back to Tomnahurich and give himself up. He headed straight back up to Tomnahurich, but, try as he might, he could not find where the door had been. He called and cried to the queen that he would come to her, but there was no sound of any reply. It slowly dawned on him that in turning the queen down, he had made an enemy for life. He had heard enough tales of the vindictiveness of the fairies when crossed to realize the situation. She would make him suffer all his days now. He somehow just knew it. He sank to his knees in the grass on the side of Tomnahurich, sobbing gently. He would never see his wife or son again. They had been spirited away by the fairies on the orders of the fairy queen herself. Suddenly he felt a light touch on his shoulder. He looked up, and there was a fairy woman, almost as beautiful as the queen herself, with the same green eyes and long red hair. "Fear not, Angus," she said in a voice like the tinkling of a mountain stream. "Fear not. The queen is not the only one who has taken notice of you. I too have been watching you, and I know that in your heart you love your wife and will never love any other. I too have fallen in love with you, Angus More, but I know you will never be mine. Now, Will you do what I tell you to get your wife back? Oh, yes, yes, thank you, Angus burst out. I will do anything to get them back. I am even ready to give myself to your queen. Oh, no, said the fairy with a wry smile. Now that you have refused her, she has no interest in anything other than making you suffer. But she is not beyond all power and hope. Right, said Angus. Tell me what to do. The following evening at sunset, Angus Moore stood on the hillside at Tomnahurich, just where he had been told to. Then, as the sun began to set, he began to sing an old magic song the fairy woman had taught him the previous night. I know the cat that was in Ulva, with its tail turned to the fire. I know. Just as he reached the third line of the song, the great door in the side of the hill swung open, and Angus's wife and son were thrust out of the fairy hall. The queen knew that if he sang any more, her own power would be threatened. She had no choice but to give him back his wife and son. Angus took his wife and son home right away and gave thanks for their rescue. What the rest of the song would have been, he had no idea, but it had worked. In his heart of hearts, he hoped the fairy who had helped him had been clever enough to avoid detection. Having felt the wrath of the queen's spite, he feared what might befall her. He never saw her or the fairy queen again. What eventually became of the fairy maiden who helped, we cannot be sure. But given that we humans cannot begin to fathom the power of the fairies, it seems likely she escaped the queen's wrath. One thing that comes up in this story and comes up in other stories as well is this fairy aversion to metal.
Yeah.
Not something I'm familiar with. What's going on with that? Why can fairies not have command over metal, or why are they afraid of it?
This is something that has puzzled people for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect it's got something to do with the fact that an awful lot of the ideas about fairies seem to have originated in an awareness of, which probably came through story anyway, of the ancestors. On a certain
Mm.
level, the fairies are the ancestors. And it's very difficult to tie this down, but it's the idea that the ancestors, the oldest people, the first people, of course, use stone tools.
Mm.
I think it's potentially, again, this is one of the things about dealing with oral tradition, because you don't have hard, fast dates for an awful lot of it. It could be that this is something to do with the idea that people thought of the ancestors as going back to the Stone Age before
Mm.
it was metal, and therefore metal was foreign to them, and
Mm.
therefore in these stories this is presented as it being almost like a taboo to the truth. That's one of
Mm.
the things. One of the things about all of this material is that we're always looking through a glass darkly.
Yeah.
And precision is not the point, because that's the other thing about stories. An awful lot of the stories that survive, and they survive because they continue to have cultural and psychological relevance. An awful lot of them do have a point.
Mm.
You can learn from them. They are
Yeah.
moral tales on at least one level, and because of that, there is something to be learned from them, and it doesn't matter when it happens or where it happens.
Mm.
It's tied up in once upon a time, because that takes you out.
Yeah.
That takes you out of the present, and it's not necessarily in the past either. It's a once upon a time. So the story doesn't have to be precise to have an effect and to have value.
I like that you brought up that whole the idea of once upon a time. I was reading a collection of, I think, Swedish stories to my daughter, like when she was going to sleep at night, and several of them opened with this line that was something like "east of the sun and west of the moon" or something like that, over and over again. And
Yes.
that got us curious, and we looked it up, and it was like, oh yes, this is an equivalent of once upon a time, and that other cultures have their same equivalents, that in the kingdom of such and such, and that's your cue to know, oh, we're talking about this fairyland, or this I don't know, this other realm that doesn't have to be tied down to a specific time and place.
Yeah. And we're not talking history.
Yeah, yeah.
History is designed to make you think certain ways. That's what history is about. But so is story to a great extent.
Mm,
Story, an awful lot of stories um, start off as myth. And the idea of myth is to give you an understanding of the world that helps you function in it. And that
mm,
is akin to what history does. But because history is dominated by nation states in the modern, it always has a political agenda. Whereas
mm,
story has, I would say, a moral, cultural, communal agenda, but it doesn't have a political.
hmm.
Not necessarily. That can come into it as well because it is, it's multifaceted.
Sure. Well, speaking of political agendas, one of the things, and I don't mean to, I don't want it at all to come across as if I'm acting as if I get to decide whether or not this book is relevant or something like that. This is just to share with you, like, sort of my experience encountering it. My wife purchased it for me,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll admit to you, Stuart, that initially I kind of assumed that as I cracked it open, I was going to encounter some of the sort of like overly romanticized, well, what you yourself refer to in parts of the book as, I think you refer to it as tartan kitsch.
Oh God, yeah.
Um, I thought maybe I would encounter some of that, and I don't mean any offense. Like I had actually seen you in some programs before that, but had not connected you as the same person who'd written it. I knew nothing. So as far as I knew nothing of the person who'd written it. I was just kind of assuming that that's kind of what I would encounter. But there was a part in the introduction where you mentioned the Disarming Act of 1746, and you clarified that it did not specify that the bagpipes were an instrument of war, and that set this thing off in my head that made me go, I could trust this person. Like, oh, we're not going to over romanticize something. We're going to kind of tell a real story, as it were, if I could use the word real. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, well,
but that does,
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
No, carry on.
Oh, just that comes into some of the stories. And another one that actually also includes some fairy aversion to metal includes the Disarming Act. It's a story called A Sad End.
Oh yeah.
Now, all over Scotland, there are stories of pipers being lured into fairy hills. If nothing else, it serves to show just how much the fairies themselves appreciated the pipers. Some of these tales, like that of Angus Moore, have happy endings, while others, like that of the lads who came out of Tomnahurich, are sad ones. There is one, however, that is particularly tragic, and it is the story of a piper who lived on the Isle of Lewis in the 1690s. He was a young and vigorous lad, and liked nothing more than to walk through the hills and along the shores near his home playing the pipes. On many a day his only audience was the wild animals and birds, as he often walked a fair distance from human habitation. Even in those days, when there were a lot more people in the islands than there have been for the past 200 years, there were many areas that were relatively uninhabited. And the young piper often wandered into these areas, playing as he went. Unknown to him, though, he had another audience. The fairies of the area, who were never too bothered about being close to humans, also had homes in these isolated glens and straths. They became accustomed to the young lad's playing in out-of-the-way places and began to really appreciate his music. So, one night, as he was heading back just before dark to his clachan near Fort William, he was met on the road by an old man in a strange green costume. Now, the young lad realized right off that the fellow was a fairy. But he had heard of how the fairies had helped pipers in the past, so was intrigued by what the creature wanted to say. "Hello, piper. Would you like to play for a dance tonight?" asked the fairy, his eyes twinkling. "Well, I might be interested, and then again I might not be," replied the piper. "It all depends on the payment." "Ah, well, we will give you food and drink of the very best, and 3 golden guineas to go with them. How would that suit you?" replied the fairy. Now the young lad knew fine well that taking drink or food from the fairies could be very dangerous indeed. But the idea of 3 guineas for a night's work seemed very attractive. "That would suit me just fine," he said. "I'll come along with you and play for the 3 guineas in advance." The fairy simply smiled at him, reached into his pocket, and pulled out 3 brand new golden guineas and handed them over. So the pair of them went off to the fairy ball, held in a great mound that the piper had walked by 100 times obliviously. For a goodly while he was careful not to drink or eat. But as the dancing went on, and the excitement at being among these beautiful eldritch creatures mounted, he began to get thirsty. At last he needed to slake his thirst between two reels, and accepted a good glass of whiskey from a beautiful fairy woman, dressed in what looked like green silk, with amazing green eyes. He tossed off the dram and started up again. The fairies once more began to dance. Several times more he took a dram, but with all the blowing he felt his wits as sharp as ever, and was sure that he would get out all right. During one lively reel he began to move about, and he felt something under his feet. He looked down and saw there was something just under the earthen floor, something hard and straight and long. Intrigued, but not losing a beat or misfingering a note, he began to kick at the object with his foot. After 2 or 3 kicks, the thing burst from the earth. It was an old sword. Just at that moment the dance finished, and, stopping playing, he bent down to touch the sword. All around him the fairies were drawing back in horror. Cold iron was something they always seemed to greatly fear. As he touched the old sword, he came to his senses, and at the same moment a breath of fresh cold air hit him from behind, as if a door had suddenly opened. With no hesitation he turned and ran straight out of the fairy hill, realizing that he had been caught up in the magic after all. The piper took a great breath of the clear mountain air, and turned to look at the fairy hill. In the first pre-dawn light there was no sign on the heather that there had ever been any door there, and no sign of the shining lights of just a second or two before. The sun was just beginning to lighten the mountain tops as he made his way towards home. He felt marvelous, even if he had been up playing all night, and he thought it might be the effects of the fairy whiskey. It certainly had tasted fine enough. He hadn't gone more than a mile or so when he thought to play himself a wee tune. Even after a whole night's playing, he wanted to play on, and wasn't tired at all. So he struck up a tune and headed down the glen, his kilt swinging. Now, early in the morning, sounds can travel a fair distance. A mile or so down that same glen, a bunch of men heard the pipes and decided to see who this was coming towards them. Down the glen came the young piper in the growing dawn light. Then he saw them, stretched out across the glen, men in red coats, with muskets, and all pointed at him. He put down his pipes and raised his arms as they came towards him. One of them spoke in Gaelic and asked him what he thought he was doing. He told them what had happened, but when the soldier translated this for his companions, it brought forth howls of laughter. "You are under arrest for wearing forbidden dress and playing the war pipes," the soldier told him, to the piper's great bemusement. 50 years had passed since he'd gone into the hill, and he had no idea of the intervening Jacobite rebellions and the cold, malicious slaughter on Culloden Moor and after. So he was taken to Stornoway jail, tried not only for breaking the law as stated in the Disarming Act of 1746, but for flaunting it by his behavior. Notwithstanding his story of having gone into the hill in the previous century, he was found guilty, and sentence was passed. The next day he was taken out and shot as a warning to others not to wear the Highland dress or to play the bagpipes.
It illustrates one of the great things about story is that story doesn't flinch.
Doesn't flinch, that's great.
And this guy who obviously gets caught up in the fairy thing and comes out 50 years later and is meets up with a bunch of redcoats who arrest him
Mm-hmm.
for just wearing the pattern, basically wearing the dress. And at that point, that was, to be hung ashore because that was part of the ethnic cleansing, the
Yeah.
pseudo-genocide that took place in the Highlands. And it's one of the problems we have actually. That period of our history is actually now undergoing major revision.
In a good way or in a bad? Like, what kind of revision do you think it's experiencing?
Well, I was very lucky. A bunch of my students a few years ago helped me transcribe this document in Edinburgh Castle Library, which actually shows the military occupation of Scotland that took place for 10 years after Culloden. And it hasn't
10
been,
years after.
oh yeah, right up to the
Oh.
mid 1750s. And I had, when I found the document, when I was actually investigating the cattle raiding between the clans, and I went to every excuse me, every organisation tasked with dealing with Scotland's past and asked for help to get this transcribed, and they all came back with the same thing. Well, we don't have a budget for that. But my
Mm.
students helped me. And then one of them, because he's a bit of a computer whiz, put up an interactive map,
Mm.
which is online. And we also, the students went off, because they were a great lot, and they went all across Scotland. And from the initial 400, we've now got it up to over 600 military installations in Scotland after COVID.
Wow. And were they finding them like remains physically of these places or asking locals for stories about them and stuff like that?
This was basically finding records that
Ah, gotcha.
had all been ignored. And it was there in plain sight. And I got
Huh.
help from various other people, some military historians as well. So we now have it up on a site called Stennis, Steninnis, Historical Society. And we have the
Mm.
interactive map that shows that Scotland was under blanket British Army occupation for 10 years after the war.
Man, I mean, of course, I'm far removed geographically and in time, but like, yeah, my impression was Culloden, they kind of came in, there was a trouncing and they left, and people were left alone for a long time after that.
No, no,
That's a really different picture.
it's a completely different picture, and it's beginning to, it'll take a while to get through, but it's out there. And as I say, again, it went out through a process that is outside normal historical, parameters,
Yeah.
because the historians don't want to deal with it because it means they have to change what they think. It's not so much.
That's interesting. It feels a little bit like the could it be? I don't know. Maybe this is silly of me to say, Stuart, but maybe it could be like something like a little bit of that sunk cost fallacy, maybe, where it's like, well, I've already written this down, speaking of the written word, right? I've already written it down, or I've already read the book. Let it match the words on the page because that's easier than having to,
Oh,
publish a new book or revise the books and stuff like that.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one of the great things, because I've been doing this quite a long time now. One of the things that I take great delight in telling my students is when I have completely changed my mind about something. Because
Oh, yeah.
I found out, because you
Yeah.
follow what's happening. You don't go in and say, well, I know what happened, so therefore this has to fit that. No, no. I mean, some of the things that I have, I've had to completely change my mind about things, because
Mm.
the more you study, the more you realize. And this is not always popular within academia. I have been on various uh, occasions being told by people at conferences, "Oh, for heaven's sake, don't say too much.
We're glad to have you here, but don't talk too much.
Don't material." It's like they're more concerned with, if there's going to be change, dole it out. You know, whereas if
Yeah,
you're doing something that completely changes how you
yeah,
understand the period of history, you've got to say it. But
yeah.
there's this kind of it's partly bourgeois respectability, but it's also the
Mm.
fact that institutions of learning are, for the people involved, really careers.
Mhm.
It's all about careers. Whereas I've never had tenure. I'm just a teaching fellow, very, very loosely attached to the university. So I don't know.
Yeah,
But a lot of these people,
yeah.
don't say too much.
The drawing of clean political lines that you mentioned, the clear-cut borders that modern nation states like to draw, and maybe it's related to this idea of like we have a clear-cut, clean version of what has happened, so don't blur those lines. It makes me think of another thing that you said in the introduction to this book, where you talked about let's see, I've got another quote from you here. It was when you're talking about different kinds of bagpipes. You're talking about lowland and border and Northumbrian pipes in difference to the Highland pipes. And I really liked what you said here. You said that people have an obsession with differentiating people on the grounds of language. You say, well, much of the tradition of the Highland pipes developed among Gaelic speakers and that of the border pipes among Scots speakers. The idea that people speaking different languages are separated in a similar fashion to people living along borders of modern nation states is somewhat simplistic. And I've heard you say elsewhere, I think you might have been talking about a colleague, but you said something like, the Highland Line exists, sure, but it's a sausage,"
Yeah,
which it took me a minute to understand what you meant.
yeah, it's true. That was the late Sandy Fenton, uh,
Mm,
um, professor at the School of Scottish Studies when it was still in existence. And he actually said, yeah, this is what you find where language is a but. You have interpenetration,
mm,
and you have sometimes local, like local languages, creoles. I mean, there's places all across the bottom where
mm.
people, the Alsace-Lorraine, Schleswig-Holstein on the continent, in particular, um, examples of that, but where people live next to each other, and even if there's a border, in a great many cases, people are going back and forth across a border, all the rest of it, and they have relationships. They,
Mm.
they intermarry. The communities work together on various levels and all the rest of it. And sometimes what this means is that their language is a combination of the two. Whereas the linguists come along and because they're studying language, they want to separate it out because it makes it easier for them to study.
Yeah, categorize everything, sure.
But that's not necessarily helpful in understanding culture.
Mm,
It can actually get in the road of understanding because people, I mean, it's recently I've been dealing with folk etymologies, or,
yeah.
where the academics hate this idea that people say that it's like that. Well, the point is, if people say that and they believe that, that affects how they think and what they do. So it's every bit as valid as something that is technically correct by the rules that the linguists have told us language must work by.
Yeah, yeah.
Speaking languages very rarely know the rules that the linguists have
Yeah,
set.
that's fascinating. Yeah.
And so you have to be aware of how people actually function, you know?
Yeah.
And quite often academics, because they're always trying to pretend they can stand back. And that my bête noire is people saying, what, yes, I'm totally unbiased. I have no dog in the fight. I can stand back. No, you've got ideas that are already set. You know, you
Mhm.
look at what you're dealing with and recognize it for what it is, and then not go in and say,
Mm.
this is wrong because I know. You know,
Right. Or because it says so in a specific book again, right? Where taking into account sort of the way people are using that word in conversation actually matters, maybe more.
absolutely. I mean, and
Yeah.
I talk a lot about the tyranny of the written word, which for someone that's written as many books as I have is a bit silly.
That is kind of funny, yeah.
But it's true, and I go back and I look at stuff I wrote 30 years ago, and some of it, my God, I'm still saying that today. And other stuff I look and say, oh no, I wouldn't say that now because
Yeah.
well, we changed. And
Well, I think that lends to the feeling that I at least get as I'm reading these stories that I can trust you. I don't know. I think that comes through, and I think that matters. Um, I don't know if it's at all entertaining to you, Stuart, but I had a fun experience years ago, and I think I was lucky to be kind of a third party with this experience. But I was I was learning Spanish myself, and I was in one Spanish speaking country, and I was with a person who spoke Spanish natively, but they were from another Spanish speaking country. And they were going on and on about how the people locally were using the wrong word for a certain color blue,
yeah,
and as a third party observer I could think to myself, oh, maybe I do that sometimes too, where it's like, no, they're not using the wrong word, because if they understand each other and what they mean, then it's the right word. That's all there is to it.
that's one of the key things I think. Particularly, when you look at place names and things like that, is that the
Mm,
people focus down on a very narrow vision of what they're looking at, and they
mm,
concentrate on linguistics. Whereas I look at place names, the same as I look at stories. What can you tell us? Does this reflect something that people believe?
mm,
If you can, this is where the geomythography thing comes in. If you can tie a place name with stories and with particular archaeology and particular landforms, which then suggest that there is a meaning to that place name, which is more than simply toponymic. It's
mm.
that is that. that's the way you've got to go. But
Mm,
it's not generally like down by people who take a narrow view. You know,
mm,
look at it purely linguistically. Uh, whereas I'm interested in what you can learn from something rather than how does it fit into an established process of analysis.
mm. Yeah, so to observe it and learn from it rather than figuring out what category it fits into. That's actually makes me think about the book itself. Another sort of paradoxical thing, right? The book is organized into sections. We've got the McCrimmons,
Yeah,
competition, pipers in the supernatural, a royal piper, lowland pipers, fighting tales, odds and ends. And maybe that odds and ends section speaks to this, but it occurred to me as I was reading through the book that it's hard to categorize some of these stories. Some of them ought to fit all over the place, you know.
absolutely. The, again, this is one of the things that I say in teaching is that when you're approaching history, people will talk about and or.
Mm.
I don't. I talk about and.
And I like that. Yeah.
Things at the same time because that's how culture works. Whereas
Mm,
and again, because my I suppose my focus is Scotland, Scottish,
mhm,
but I do look at other places and I do bring in samples which match Scotland in some of the books. Uh, the what I have realised is that what I'm studying is human culture. That's basically what
mm,
it is. And again, it comes back to this thing of it always exists where it exists.
mm.
You know, this localization thing. Whereas people are always trying to give you a big picture. No, I want you to hear and be there, you know, find out more about how ideas have come through in one place, even if it's the same pattern as somewhere else entirely, they're still their own because
Mm.
everybody has their own kind of local mind map of where they live. And this was very much the case until
I, I think that comes through for me as a person who's an outsider who doesn't know the geography. How still the places are key in all of the stories, even in small ways. It's all about he went, the subject of the story. He moved from one clachan to the next. Like there's movement in geography in all of these stories. Um, and I wonder, as a musician and as a songwriter yourself, I wonder if this will seem at all relatable to you or to the idea of storytelling. I've heard people say before that when you're writing a song, if you want it to be universally applicable, don't write in universal general terms. Instead, write something specific about your specific experience, and that will be universally applicable.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
mm,
it's about the individual state, you know,
mm,
on this. And the idea here that underpins a lot of this for me is this idea that everybody has a mind map of where they live. Uh,
mm,
this is something that builds up over time. And in a pre-literate world, that mind map is composed of understanding your environment through the stories you've been told. And
mm.
that mind map that you have is not going to be identical to your brother and your sisters. It's going to be
Sure.
close, but it's not going to be identical because you have different experiences. You're older,
Yeah.
younger, things have happened that you know that they don't know. So it's personalized because,
Mm.
I mean, I've been playing around with this. This is an idea for what we're all like snowflakes, you know?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
We're all totally unique. So are we, you know?
Yeah.
And it's understanding that underpins all of this. So, yes, you have to have that, you know, concentration of what you're about. That's what
Mm.
made the Beatles so great. You saw the one way they saw.
Yeah. That's fun. I hadn't thought of it this way before, but just this weekend, my wife and I we took our kids up into the canyon. We live in the sort of a very mountainous region, and so we went up into the canyon to see a lake with the kids. And as we were driving back home, we live right next to two really very very distinctive mountains that are next to each other, and we were driving back through them. So my kids were seeing them from the opposite side, and they live with these mountains always on the east every morning and every night, they're always there. And my one son, who's 10 years old, he looked out the window and he went, "Whoa, it's so weird to see the ridges going backwards." And just to realize that
Yeah,
he's building that, he's got a model of what his world looks like, and he's seeing it from the back end all of a sudden, you know?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I need to make up some stories. I need to tie some stories to these mountains, to tell to him.
Well, maybe there are some,
I'm sure there are. There's gotta be some, yeah.
because this is one of the things that is key, I believe, to understanding the whole process of oral transmission. People hear things, people are told things, but they were told it by the grandmother.
Mm,
So they might tell it to their own grandkids, but they don't think it's worthy of note because it's not coming from an authoritative source. So
mm,
this is actually how things survive. This is how stories survive. Story, I mean, like there's a story that I tell about this witch who was turned to stone by a devil, by the devil, over not far from me in Fife, and that story I can trace back probably several thousand years.
hmm,
Uh, but the cafe that was named after her only shut 5 years ago.
hmm.
The story continues. It's part of local culture, and an awful lot of this type of material, people are not aware of it having any real significance because at school they don't get encouraged to
Yeah.
think about what's your stories, what's your no, it's the stories that are coming in from elsewhere, and it's a bit like the kind of bourgeois notion of art, which is something that you buy, or
Mm.
ballet, symphonic music, and all the rest of it. Whereas no culture is what is human beings create and within their own locale for themselves.
Hmm. Maybe as a musician, this is something that you've encountered or thought about, Stuart. I've heard people say before that people in general don't make as much music as they used to, and that this is because of the radio and professional music. And so, like people at home in the evenings think to themselves, "I can't make music because I listen to professionals make music all day long, and since I'm not a professional, I won't make music."
Well,
Whereas, without that professionalization of it, everybody would have been making music in a previous age.
well, you know, there's not as many guitar shops in Edinburgh as there were 20 years ago, but a couple of
Hmm.
absolutely gigantic.
Mm, mm. So
So,
maybe there's nothing to that. Maybe that's a hopeful idea. Maybe we're all still making as much music as ever, huh?
and the piano shop that I used to live around the corner from, which has been there 50 years, is still going strong.
Mm,
Uh, I'm not sure. I think partially because of the access that electronic media gives to people, I think more people are interested in the idea of possibly being performers than ever
mm.
before. And that kind of pushes uh, more people into music.
Oh, there you I prefer that picture of the world. I'll adopt that picture, Stuart. I like that better.
Apropos of that, there was something I'm not sure. I haven't reread the whole book. I'm not sure if there was if I actually put it in here. But one of the things about the bagpipes that I've
Mm,
not been able to stand up in Scotland, partially because the survival of so much of the music came through the army after the peace,
yeah.
um, subsequent to Culloden. But one of my students uh, is from northwest northwest Spain,
Oh,
and they have the gaita
yeah.
form of bagpipes over there. And he told me, because he's a traditional gaita player, that he had been instructed when he started out that he had to make his own instrument,
Hmm.
and that this was traditional practice, that you had to be able to make your own instrument. And I'm wondering if that's the same thing as well, that would be part of your apprenticeship,
Yeah, interesting.
that you would have to learn because I mean, if you're living up, up the Glen, and even if you're part of a much bigger clan, you're living up the Glen, and something goes wrong with your pipes, who's going to get fixed it?
Right, yeah.
You know, uh,
You
I,
know, That's interesting, Stuart. This was a major anxiety for me and for a lot of my friends when the COVID-19 pandemic shut things down. We wanted to feed our families, of course, but item number 2 was, where am I gonna get my reeds?
Right. Yeah.
And I know people who play the oboe, and oboe reeds are very similar to bagpipe, Highland bagpipe reeds, chanter reeds. And everybody who I know who plays the oboe has at least some awareness of how to repair and manufacture their own reeds.
Yeah.
And they're so similar. And I think to myself, I don't know how to do that, and maybe I ought to.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and I have wondered before if maybe it's precisely what you mentioned that, maybe the military, use of bagpipes led has given us a world today where there's a lot of, you can do mass manufacturing of bagpipes, and maybe that kind of makes it more of a thing that you buy off the shelf,
Yeah.
not so much a thing that you do on your own. Though there are people who do it on their own, of course, but,
I think so.
maybe.
The but I think the process must have been that in, let's even go back 300-400 years, that people would have had to be capable of repairing their own instruments, even if they couldn't
Mm,
play. And I think they would always have been particularly good makers anyway. I think,
mm,
but this process that Harvey was telling me about, that he actually had to build his own right. And he said the guy that taught him was an old bloke. And he said he was very, very insistent on this. He said, it's got to be done right. This is what to do, and all this. And
mm,
part of the that process was, I think, simply to be able to continue. Because if your bagpipes break,
mm.
are you still a bagpiper if you don't have an instrument?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
So
that's yeah.
I've built one guitar and I can do running repairs on guitars. And over the years, I learned how to do repairs on, various bits and pieces of kit because you had to do it. And I don't think it would be that. I think because of the nature of how piping existed before the militarization thing, people must have had some level of skill. And they'd probably go to the local blacksmith, and the blacksmith would know a certain
Mm,
thing, but they would have to be taught certain things. That's making reeds, absolutely.
mhm,
And there was it's a little more than a rumour, but among the travelling people of Scotland, who like are indigenous,
mhm.
not gypsies, but indigenous to Scotland and Ireland, our travelling people. I worked with them over the years, and one of them actually told me, that the one of my mother's family were Fowls, and I was asking, did they ever hear of any Fowls? And she said, oh, aye, there used to be Fowls. Great reed makers,
Great reed makers, interesting.
you know, because
Huh,
the pipes, the travelling people, a great many good pipers amongst them,
yeah,
because they travelled about the country and they had to earn their money. And
sure,
they were
yeah.
good, so most of them could turn their hands to a lot. A lot of the men were pipers as well. So, and they had to have somebody that made the reeds, particularly
Hmm.
when there were shops.
Well, Stuart, speaking of, the piping tradition from before and stories that are difficult to categorize, even though I was looking at, pipers in the supernatural, a piper who surely, to whatever degree the McCrimmons, however many McCrimmons definitely did exist and definitely did play pipes, surely they knew how to make reeds. They must have, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, they must have.
yeah,
And you've got a story in your McCrimmon section of the book that I can see would have been a challenge. I can imagine that maybe as you were putting the story together, trying to decide, now, do I put this in the supernatural section or do I put this in the McCrimmon section? It's the one that's called The Black Lad McCrimmon and the Banshee.
all right.
I thought that was a really great story. I enjoyed that one a lot. Now it is well known that fairies and other types of spirits loved music, and there were often good players among them. In the Highlands, most of these magical creatures played the bagpipes, and it was the quality of their music, no doubt, that led to the stories of people being lured into fairy mounds for what seemed a night but turned out to be 100 years or more. Now and again, one of these otherworldly creatures would take a human under his wing and give him the fairy skill at music. Up till the time of the McCrimmon known as the Black Lad, his family were no better than any other decent pipers in Scotland. Sure, some of them were pipers, and some were not. But what happened to the Black Lad changed all that forever. Now the Black Lad, Ungilly Doo, was the youngest of 3 sons and the least thought of by his father. They all lived together on Skye. His father would take the crooked stick of the great bagpipes, which he called the Black Gate, from behind the door, and he himself would play. He was happy to let his 2 eldest sons play on his pipes, but the 3rd son, the Black Lad, was not considered worth such an honor, and wouldn't even get a blow on the pipes. He was generally bad treated, and treated as little more than a slave by his father and his brothers. One day the 3 of them went off to a nearby fair, leaving the Black Lad on his own. He was a bright lad, despite what his family thought, and had been learning the chanter on the sly, mainly by observing his father and brothers when they played and listening closely. So that day, thinking he was alone, he took the chanter from his father's pipes and struck up a tune. He was sitting there happily playing away on the chanter when who should come upon him but the Banshee who looked after the MacLeods. As the McCrimmons were a sept of that clan, the Banshee was watching over them as well. Now, usually, people only heard the Banshee when she cried out to forewarn of imminent death or disaster to the clan, but she was always about, if unseen. So the Black Lad is there, concentrating on his fingerwork, when suddenly this female sprite appears before him. "Playing music, then, are we?" she asks, and the young fellow was so surprised he just answered straight off, I am that." He was so surprised that he didn't have time to be frightened of this spectral being, though he immediately knew who she was. "Well then, lad, would you rather have skill without success, or success without skill?" she asked him, her head on one side and looking at him from under her bushy eyebrows. "Skill without success," he answered back with no hesitation at all. "Skill without success. Well then," she said, "let's just see." And she pulled a hair from her hoary old head and asked him to tie it round the reed of the chanter. And when that was done, she told him, "Now take the chanter in your hands, and I will lay my fingers on thy fingers." So they did. "Now, when I lift my fingers, lift thou the one that happens to be underneath it. Think of any tune you like and play it along with me." He did just that, and played the tune with great skill. When he finished the tune, he just sat there, looking from the chanter to the Banshee and back again. Surely he couldn't have played that. Then the Banshee said to him, "Now thou art the king of the pipers. Thine equal was not before thee, and thine equal shall not come after thee." Just as soon as she had said that, she was gone. Filled with amazement and happiness, he got down the black gate from behind the door and started to play. There was not a tune that he could think of but he could play it right away, almost without thinking. So on and on he played, unaware of time passing, till his father and his brothers were getting back home from the fair. They had had a drop or two of whiskey and were humming and singing tunes to each other as they came along the road. As they came near to the house, they heard this wonderful music being played and stopped to listen. "Whoever that great piper is, he's playing on the Black Gate," said the father. "I would recognize the sound of my own pipes anywhere. Come, lads, let's see who it is." And they hurried to see who was playing. But just before they got to the house, the music ceased. They looked at each other and said not a word. A suspicion was forming in their minds, and when they came into the cottage to find the Black Lad sitting alone by the fire, they said not a word, but exchanged meaningful glances. Later that night, the father took down the Black Gate from behind the door, and this time, after he and his 2 eldest sons had played, he turned to the Black Lad. "Now you play," he said. "But I am not worthy of the honor. I am happy as I am," the young man replied. "Do as you are told and take the bagpipes," said his father, "and we'll all start mucking in about the place from now on." He went on with a smile on his face. So the Black Lad played in front of his family for the very first time, and wasn't he better than any of them, and better than anyone else they had ever heard before. "The music has left us," said the father to his 2 other sons. "None of us will come in the wake of the Black Lad." And he spoke the truth, for never before or since has there been a piper who could play as well as the Black Lad. And one of my favorite things in that story that I wanted to ask you about, and I don't even know what to ask you about. This is one of those Chris Farley interviewing Paul McCartney moments where I don't know what to say other than "that's so cool." Is when the banshee asks this young McCrimmon, "Would you rather have skill without success or success without skill?" I feel like I've heard, what do you call that when you have these two options? It's like a pairing, a couplet, a doublet, there's some name for things like that. I feel like I've heard similar things like that before in other stories. Do you see some like the options like that being presented by the supernatural characters that pop up in stories more than once?
Oh yeah, one of the things about the supernatural that gets overlooked in the modern world because just probably more because of commercialization than anything else is that the supernatural is based on us.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
if you look at, like, I've been doing all this work on what's essentially ancient, very ancient belief, in pre-Christian times here in Scotland. And there's this figure of the kayak, she's a goddess. It's the only way I can
Hmm.
describe her. And in one version, she has one tooth, one eye, and one leg.
Yeah. Okay. I thought that name sounded familiar. Yeah.
Yeah, one particular poem. But the presentation of her, as with all other mythological beings, is that yes, they are supernatural, yes, they have powers, but they are still recognizably based on human types.
Hmm.
And this is necessary for them to be absorbable by children.
Hmm.
Because children were taught through story. And just as the story, you find the same stories all across the world because people set the stories within their own environment so as children will understand it. There's no point in
Hmm.
teaching children about Mount Olympus if you're sitting in
Sure.
Glasgow. It
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
So just as the stories are set in the known landscape, the known environment of the community, so the supernatural creatures have to be recognizable to some
Hmm.
extent for the point that's being made to get over. They can't be totally, even vampires walk on two legs. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It's it's not beyond comprehension for children to understand most of our supernatural features. They are based on human archetypes.
That's interesting. I mean, as you describe it, Stuart, that makes so much sense. But I'm not used to thinking of the supernatural as human. I think I'm used to thinking of it as exactly the opposite of that, as being weird and out there. But
Yeah.
I guess I mean it makes a lot of sense. It wouldn't have sticking power. It wouldn't be relatable if it wasn't relatable, would it?
Also, got to remember that until certainly within the past couple of hundred years, people did believe that it's Samhain, Halloween, that the dead came back.
Mm,
And one of the fun aspects of this over the years that we've had playing with is guising, disguising yourself, cross dressing, right?
hmm
Is something that has gone on at that time of year for a very, very long time. Not transvestism, just cross dressing. Um, and the whole point of that is basically to disguise yourself so as, if your dead grandmother's coming along the road, she won't recognize you. You are
Oh, I see.
disguised.
Yeah.
And in Orkney, well into the 19th century, I've forgotten what the actual name for the group was. It's just gone up my head. But these are guys, they dressed in straw costumes, like great big like straw dresses and hats.
Mm,
And a lot of them would go about uh, creating mischief, chucking on people's doors, all kinds of, the usual.
sure. Yeah.
And it was believed that in amongst these different groups wandering about in Orkney, that there was always at least one of those groups that was completely composed of dead people.
Oh, 'cause since everybody's wearing those straw costumes, you can't tell which is gonna be. Oh, wow.
Also, that whole frisson of fear thing, which is part of what Sabine is about, uh, is always there. Oh, not them, it's like,
Yeah.
you know, keep you on edge, you know. And
Yeah.
it's a lot hairier than trick or treat.
Yeah, I like yeah, it sure is.
You know,
Oh, that's really interesting.
and
That's
that's
it almost makes me I mean, you're right, it's a lot hairier, it's a little scarier, but makes me, feel a little jealous. I kinda want to enter that world, you know? Like, it sounds like a world that's a little more tinged with magic than what I experience.
it's changed. It has become awful commercialized over here. Um,
Yeah.
one of the one of the key things in a couple of days, I'll be going out and buying a neep, right,
Hmm.
which stews the turnip, and I make at least one turnip lantern. You know, you turn it into a skull.
Yeah.
I always do this, at least one, sometimes two for my grandkids, and so does my son. Uh,
Hmm.
he also will make a pumpkin one because the pumpkin ones are easy. Making them out,
Yeah.
making one out of a turnip is hard work. You
I
know,
bet it is. I've never done it myself, but I can imagine it'd be a lot harder.
worth it because they look much more like actual skulls because
Huh.
they're human size. You know, whereas pumpkin,
Yeah.
yeah. So I wouldn't have a pumpkin near the place, but that you don't see so many of because
Yeah.
again things change. You know,
Hmm.
nothing stands still, so you have to just
Hmm.
go with the flow. But the idea of it's in a way you can actually see the neat lantern, which is a skull, is very much like the same kind of thing as the Mexican, Day of the Dead, where
Hmm.
traditionally people exposed the children to the idea of death because it's part of life.
Yeah.
The thing that underpins the whole notion of Halloween and Samhain, though that seems to be going away, with the over commercialization.
Yeah. Yeah, I lived in Mexico for a little while, and that was easily my favorite time of year. I was there for a few years, and it was. I don't want to say that I had an aversion to the idea of death in general or celebrating it or anything like that before then, but for me personally, this was my first experience, and it was a beautiful experience with this like embracing and even celebrating it as I don't know, it just I don't think that I had given that practice or that holiday, any kind of credit,
Mm-hmm.
before being in a place where it's genuinely celebrated, and it was a pretty cool thing to experience it for in person.
Yes. Um,
Mm,
and this wasn't me initially came up with the idea. It was a wonderful singer and folklorist Margaret Bennett. You may have come across her son Martin Bennett.
yeah, I mean, that name certainly seems familiar, yeah.
Oh, I mean, he's no longer with us. He died in his early 30s. Tragic. The man was a genius. But he was a great piper. I mean, he's the first person ever in the world to actually, in fact, I remember him getting up at Hamish Henderson's 80th birthday party. No, it was before that, 70th. Uh, and he was only about 14 in about that. And he got up with
Mm,
in this room full of musicians, wearing his kilt, and he got up and he had this boombox. He switched on the boombox, the whole thing, and started playing the pipes. And he just destroyed the room. Come,
yeah, they
he's
just loved it.
been playing, 150 years, and everybody in the room just went, "What?" It was like, boom, and fusion, Celtic fusion.
Yeah.
That started that day. And she said to me, um, it was a friend's funeral, uh, that for some reason, I don't know why we got on the topic, but we were discussing how people look at traditional cultures and the idea of ancestor worship. And she said,
Mm,
"There's such thing as ancestor." She says, it's nonsense. It's overeducated, imperialist thinking, white people
mm,
opposing this. She said, what it is quite simple. It's respect, and that respect definitely borders on the reverence. And over the years, rituals that are attached to activities you take to show that respect will look like
Mm.
Once ritualised, but it's not. And it's respect for the ancestors, because the ancestors are the ones that prepared the public for this community. And traditionally, that awareness is accompanied by the fact that you're going to be an ancestor yourself.
Of course, yeah.
It's the cycle, you know, and that's what Halloween is about.
Hmm.
It's about that awareness, because time, just as literature limits things, so our modern idea of linear time wasn't really. I mean, even in some place like Scotland, time only becomes fixed when the railways,
Hmm.
because the sun rises and sets in different places. So noon is,
Oh, sure.
but then suddenly it all becomes, you have to have the same time because you know when the train will come, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I had my stress over coordinating our times, our timetables to meet for this interview even.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm over in, Utah, in the west side of the United States.
oh yeah. I've not actually
Yeah.
been, but I know roughly where you
Well, you know, selfishly, I would love to get you interested in the Utah landscape and the stories that are attached to, the deserts and the red rock and stuff over here, because I'd love to hear your take on some of the stuff. So maybe if you get a few years where you don't know what else to do, come travel through the American Southwest. Let's let's get some books over here.
are. No, I don't know how things are going to go, but I'm at the moment where I'm thinking no more books for a while, or if I do write any books, I'm going to go and start writing fiction, because
Oh, some fiction. Well, that'd be fun.
well, I'm just fed up, you know,
Well,
notes.
you've written a lot of books, Stuart. I think if anybody has a right to say, I think I've written enough, you're in that club. You've written quite a bit.
40 now. That's, people ask me how do you do it, and the answer is quite simple: start and finish, and that's all I know. There is
Huh.
methodology to start. I've never really been, and I've learned quite a lot from indigenous stories, not just in America but in Australia as well.
Hmm.
There are techniques. In fact, one of the best ones. Here's one. I'm not sure. I think it was probably Plains tribe this came from, but this is to me, it's absolutely brilliant. Um, Storyteller sitting within his community, right? And he tells a story, and the story has a particular point. And in that story, if the storyteller knows what he's doing, he can draw attention to someone who is not behaving properly,
Hmm.
put them in the story, call them out without them losing face.
Because it's not actually them. It's sort of a pseudo them, huh?
It's a version of them that is showing
Yeah.
attention to the fact that, hey, we know what you're up to, stop it. And it can be done.
Yeah.
They call this shooting arrows.
Shooting arrows, huh?
You shoot an arrow at the person because,
Yeah.
and to me, it's something that is so human.
S Stuart, I was just gonna say, I think my mother did that actually when I was a kid. I remember her we'd be trying to go to bed and we'd get my mom or my dad to read us books or tell us stories at night. And I feel sure I can remember my mom telling stories about a naughty little boy who didn't have the same name as me, but it was pretty
Yeah,
obvious.
absolutely. Again, because what you're looking at with the oral tradition, uh,
Mm,
something that has been honed and developed. We're now thinking, what, a million and a half years?
mm,
Humanity has been on the planet in one shape or another. And over all that time, we've had oral transmission. And the
mm.
sophistication that can develop over that time. I mean, writing's only been around at most 6,000 years. You know, it's that Johnny come lately kind of stuff. Whereas the oral tradition has got the capacity to be everything because it wasn't, you know,
Speaking of sort of like the ancientness of the oral tradition, there's a kind of story that I really like anytime I encounter them. The just so stories or the pourquoi tales, that tell like how the cheetah got its spots and how the zebra got its stripes and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like that kind of story, it must be old, right? That must be another one of those things that humans have been doing for a very long time. You see a thing and you go, "Well, how did it get that way?" And you get a story about how it got that way.
Well, I think, I mean, the time scale in Australia, because we know about the protodons, these
Mm.
extinct animals. We know that the stories there are probably have been told for 40,000 years in a culture that had no writing. They do
Mm.
know what you might call a grammar of ornament, because an awful lot of the storytelling in Australia is accompanied by doing either sand paintings or actual paintings. So,
Oh, so kind of like symbols that remind you how it goes or where to take a turn in the story and stuff like that.
so they have that, but they don't
Mm.
have writing as such. But
I got you.
a couple of years ago, there was a wonderful example on television here. There was a program about up in Orkney, at the north of Scotland. There's been this very important archaeological dig going on. What was probably the biggest stone building on the planet about 5,000 years ago was knocked down. We found the evidence for it was knocked down and used to build a lot of smaller ones. And they were doing
Oh,
it. Yeah, broad.
I think I saw a documentary about this. Yeah. Yeah, go on.
It's absolutely fabulous. And while they were there, they had an engineer who was there, and they were trying to figure out how they shifted megaliths, you know, these big stones, some of which could be 20.
Mhm.
And they had a whole load of volunteers, and they had the ropes, and they had tree trunks as rollers, and all kinds of things. And they had a really hard time. When this local guy said, "Well, there is another way of doing that." What's that? I said, "Well, we were always told we use seaweed,
Seaweed.
yeah, which was plenty of in Orkney." So they went and got
Yeah. Oh, and they just slid it along.
yeah, and they just slid it along. And that was a guy called David Teller, who was the Standing Stones Hotel up there. And he had been told that in his family
Yeah.
from 5,000 years before. And nobody
That
on the program made any mention of the fact that they just had data from 5,000 years ago given them by a local person because he wasn't an expert.
yeah, he wasn't qualified.
Yeah, you know? So the stuff's there. You
Yeah.
know?
That it's fascinating because it, like, paints this picture of storytelling, and maybe this is obvious to you, Stuart, as a professional storyteller, but it's blowing my mind as a normal dude over here, you know? The ways that story seems to be being put to use as a kind of tool or technology, of its own, whether it's to correct bad behavior in the family group or to pass on significant, like, really important engineering practices, you know?
Yeah,
And look at how solid it is to have carried solid information for such a long time. That's amazing.
it is. And it's beginning to be understood by younger archaeologists, but there's still archaeologists, you know, I mean, I'm pretty ancient, and it is probably an older generation. But I've actually had people actually just say, "No, I'm not going to accept that. I'm
Huh.
not going to accept that we can learn this from oral stories." But I like to say, the stuff about after Culloden, that came because I was following stories about candle reading, and it led me into
Mm.
a particular place, and then I found all this other information, which was all there, but people had been ignoring it. And then I've also found stories that have never been written down, and I get students to bring me stories
Mm.
because they don't know that necessarily what they know is of significance to someone tells them because it's just a story.
Right, that's the phrase that comes to mind, right? Well, it's just a story. It's just something I heard.
Yeah,
I I wish I were better qualified with this, Stuart. I have a good friend, my good friend John Charles has been doing work for years, taking Porch de Buell songs and working them out on small pipes, so that the pipes mimic the Porch de Buell very closely. And he's talked to me before about the prevalence of cattle and cattle raiding in these songs.
so it's
Uh,
fundamental because the, the the whole society. in the Highlands and also earlier in the rest of Scotland, and I presume in most of it before England got, you know, taken over by the Romans, was basically these are pastoralist societies. They live in small groups. They raise cattle. They are warrior societies, and how the warrior function works out is that they raid other communities. And you don't raid close
Hmm.
by ones. You go a long distance, obviously, because otherwise you would, you'd never be stopped fighting. But you
Right. You don't. Yeah.
go after the harvest is in, right? Generally small groups up to a dozen. Sometimes they're much bigger and get involved in politics. But generally the raiding, and this is common to all pastoral societies across the planet. Just in Scotland, it survived in the 18th century, and we have lots of evidence of it. And what you do is you go and, by a combination of skill, hopefully, if you're good at what you do, you go and you lift somebody's cattle and you bring them home. If they catch up with you, there will be a fight. But
Mm.
there are rules to the fight. But all male members of the clan are trained in the use of weapons so as they can be part of this. They don't necessarily all get involved in it, but they're all trained to be able to fight if necessary. And the chiefs have to lead at least one of these while they're young. It's part of
Kind of
the
kind of
process.
earn their spot.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
And it's fundamental. And it goes on. I mean, like I say, I actually saw a documentary 10 years ago now, maybe something like that, of the same thing still going on the Ethiopia-Kenya border. Because they're
Mm.
pastoral societies and they were still doing it. And it still had it was described by somebody in Italy, actually, as at times verging on sport, you know?
Interesting. That's interesting because I was just thinking to myself, like, it sounds almost like it could be a means of entertainment. If you looked around and felt a little bit bored, you might just say, "Well, let's go steal some cattle."
It has to be at the right time of year, because you
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
know you're on. But the advantage to it is that it gives the training
Mm.
of the Highland warriors who were, non-pareil. They really were. They were the most outstanding warriors the world has probably ever seen. Out on a horse, sleep out in the snow,
Mm.
carry their own food for a week. They were just, they were absolutely amazing. It's absolutely fundamental to how the cohesion uh, of that warrior tradition are held together. And so, therefore, the cattle are very important. But also, it goes further than that because in the modern world, people are very interested in what used to be the feast days, Beltane, Halloween as well. But Beltane's a
Mm.
big thing over here. We have an annual Beltane in Edinburgh, I've had for 50 years. Big fire festival. But what that was about, apart from people having a party, we recently came across the notion of talk about the fires of Beltane, two fires. The cattle were driven between two fires, and one of the woods that was being used is juniper. Juniper smoke was being used as late as the Crimean War as an antiseptic.
Oh, so there.
They're basically
This is.
rid of the ticks after the cattle have been inside
Ah, yeah.
during the winter and early spring, and then they're taken out and they're sent way up the hills. But before they do, they're driven.
They bathe them in juniper smoke.
Yeah, and
Wow.
it's practical.
Y-
It's part of that looking after the cattle. Whereas
Yeah.
think about Beltane as being, it's all spiritual, supernatural.
Uh huh.
And like an awful lot of traditional societies everywhere, it's grounded in practicality.
Yeah.
The repetition and the growth of ritual, it takes on other aspects, but it's grounded in practicality.
That's interesting. So then, like, stories and rituals might build up as, again, like a kind of technology to bottle up this important information and make sure it gets carried along. But then we looking at it as, I say we, me, I didn't know this about juniper smoke. If I saw that, I would have just thought like, oh, they like the color of it or it smells nice or something. It's this mystical woo woo thing. Who knows why they did it? Eh. they were cavemen, like I would just be so dismissive of it. Wow, that is really interesting. Um, yeah, man. Do you think maybe it's too hard to say, but I mean, would there have existed and for many generations in general, like would everybody have understood that like, oh, the cattle have ticks now and the smoke gets rid of the ticks? And would they think we were so silly for assigning more stories to it than that? Or is it like the kind of thing where, well, we're not sure why it seems to go well when we burn juniper, but it does seem to go well, so we'll keep doing it.
Well, partially it's if it works, you know,
Yeah.
don't try and fix
If it
it.
works, it works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it works, it works. And it's that part of this inheritance. Uh,
Mm.
Sometimes, like, in later years, particularly 19th century, when you find out that, that there are traditions being carried on, and you wonder if people actually did understand what was initially behind them. But then again, do they have to? Because one of the things that people don't give enough credence to in all of this notion of early feasting, let's just call it that, is it's a
Mm.
party.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
People
mean,
do like parties. Maybe that's all there is to it, huh?
it's when these big gatherings, because people are living. I mean, in Scotland, we know we've got absolute proof that 98.67% of the population are living in groups of probably no more than 30, right up
Mm.
to the middle of the 18th century.
Mm.
Tiny wee scattered communities. You need big things happening so as you can go and find yourself somebody.
Mm.
It's finding a mate.
Yeah.
Because if there's only 30 of you, and okay, you'll be in touch with another firm tune, you call them in the lowlands, a couple of miles down the road and another one a couple of miles that way and all the rest of it. Yeah, fine. I mean, you're not totally isolated, but
Yeah.
the chance of, going to some big event like this, where there's going to be hundreds of people, all the young folk will be, all
Yeah.
their best, and they'll all be, tatted up kind of thing, because
Right.
the opportunity for what is absolutely necessary for the community is for there to be another generation.
Yeah.
I
Mm.
mean, because we're talking in Scottish terms, and this is not unique to Scotland, but as I know about Scotland, we're talking about communities that have probably been in existence, living on or very close to the same bit of ground over thousands of years.
Mm.
So they've got techniques and knowledge that has built up, and an awful lot of it, I believe, would not be necessarily intellectual how they saw things. They would respond to things because they always had to, and that includes, the relationship with the land, which I mean, I'm not sure who to speak to, but I need to find someone who's done some work on this. But how close does human attachment to the land echo the territoriality of animals? Because animals are very
Mm.
specifically territorial. We're animals,
Mhm.
you know.
We forget it a lot though, don't we?
And again, if you're part of a culture that's been on the same piece of land for, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years, that
Mm.
relationship that your community has with that land is incredibly sophisticated.
I read a few years ago a book that my wife finds all the books that I enjoy. She checked it out for me at the library and brought it to me, and I wish I could remember who wrote it. It was about the Iliad and the Odyssey and other Greek stories.
Right?
And but what struck me reading the introduction was the person who wrote this book was writing about being in Greece for the first time in their life, having studied these stories for many, many years already,
Mhm.
and just how different it was just to be on a boat in the Mediterranean, or like, or just to be on the right hill and to look around and think about the stories and just what a breakthrough it was for so many things.
Yeah.
Um, and it makes me feel like I mentioned to you, Stuart, I've been playing bagpipes, specifically Scottish style bagpipes, for a couple decades now, and there are so many tunes that have place names that I have no connection to these places at all, and sometimes I feel like I'm missing out, you know? I feel like I only can have a shallow experience of this thing that I love
Yeah,
because of where I live, you know, because of that connection or lack of connection to the land that these songs are tied to.
yeah, but the part of that is also tied to the whole diaspora notion. Um,
Mm,
when people, I mean, like one of the great things about piping, I didn't know until I wrote this particular book, was the fact that some original material survived because somebody took it to Australia. You know,
oh, sure, yeah.
survived in Australia, and it made me think that not everything is or has been sculpted by the influence of the British Army because
Mm,
they're incredible. I mean, for a start, the sporran, you would not wear your sporran in front of your genitalia if you were running down a hill.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
You know, but for the army, you know, because there's a lot of things, but there are things that sneak through, and one of them that I've been meaning to follow up on this, and I just haven't had the time. But there's a very famous tune, Mrs. MacLeod of Rassay.
Sure, yeah, I know the tune, yeah.
Everybody knows it. You know what its original name was? Akaya. That's the goddess. Uh,
Oh,
that's what.
this is her? This is about her?
Yeah. Well, I have wondered. So I've been playing
Huh,
around and different tempos, and looking to see if I can do, pardon me, a bit more because although I play guitar, I do sort of play around with traditional modes a lot. Um,
uh-huh,
you know, I just it's just what I love doing. But the fact it was initially called a kayak makes me wonder how old is that?
yeah,
You
huh,
because we're so used to the repertoire that we have, and knowing that it
yeah.
through the British Army, uh, that kind of limits it. But also, has anybody looked and said, well, can we dig deeper in it? Is there more?
That's oh,
You
man, I wonder, do you think this could have maybe in a similar way to the way that, like, oral storytelling is in some ways sort of like, squashed by the written word in books? Could this also have anything to do with going back to when these tunes are written down in order to be disseminated in the military piping program precisely, so we only go back that far and we don't even think to look beyond that?
Absolutely, because
Huh,
I did a companion book to this of fiddle tales. That I got in just because obviously it survives in a totally different way from the piping tradition. And in the course of looking into that, I began to realise that the the process of writing tunes, and there was a heck of a lot of new stuff written, particularly in the 18th century, because there was all this fiddle dance music. I mean, there was a dance craze and so on. And what I began to realise was that most, if not all, of the new tunes probably came from improvisation.
hmm,
And this is because we have inherent, partly because of the pipe thing, but partly also just general cultural matters. We tend to think that what we get from the past we have to revere. No, you can revere it and you can care about it, but that doesn't mean that's where it finishes. So
hmm,
the new tunes probably were arising all the time because people were improvising.
hmm,
And the idea that improvising only comes in with jazz, well, where did they get it from? Because if
yeah.
you particularly about the pre-Baroque tradition and what you're doing, with the extent when you're extending the tradition, people are improvising in that all the time.
Yeah, I have a friend who does, he's actually I think he's, currently is he the president of the Lowland Pipers Society? He's a historian by professionally, and he's also a professional piper as well. Jeremy, who does the Way Two Twags Bagpipe and History podcast as well. He's talked about he plays through variation sets
Mm.
sometimes, and he's talked before about how, like, well, I mean, and to what degree has he talked about it, and to what degree does it just come across inherently? I'm not sure, but just the variation sets, even those are written down selections of some of the variations. Surely there were surely more, you know. Uh,
And if you
I'm
think,
so glad. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Stuart.
if you're playing for a dance, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I've done this in folk rock bands, for heaven's sake. You're playing for a dance, and it's at 11 o'clock, and you know you're going to be playing at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
The others leading the band says, "Yeah, another chorus." You know, you're spinning things out, and when
You
the
got to stretch it out. Yeah.
ones you do is you start improvising.
Yeah.
And it might only start initially with shuffling a beat and changing the beat and all the rest of it. But then somebody's going to chuck in an extra couple of notes. So I believe that improvisation has been part of this tradition, um,
Mm.
and that disappeared with the army. And I mean, I know it's back. You know,
Well, I'm really glad that you bring this up, Stuart, because there's a part in the introduction that I just about skipped over, but it's one of my favorite parts, and it was one of the another key part that made me go, "Whoa, this book is really good. I'm excited to read the rest of it." Was where you said you were talking about Pibroch, and you said, "While no one can dispute the majesty and wonder of good Pibroch, to suggest that its origin is different from Keobeg, the little music, comprising dances, marches, airs, etc., is unsustainable." And this, for me at least, was like a relief to hear because there's a lot of majesty and mystique, at least for me as a piper where I'm at, wrapped up in Pibroch. Like it's almost like, well, if I'm only playing marches and jigs and reels and strathspeys and the like, then I'm doing the silly music, like the throwaway music. Like the serious music is the Pibroch, and I want to be cautious saying that because, like you say, there's no disputing the majesty and wonder of good pibroch playing, obviously. I feel like this is kind of like looking at the military tradition of piping as well, where it's like there's this fraught relationship here where it's like if that didn't exist, would we have it could be it's like a very useful time capsule and a good teaching tool and it gets instruments made quickly and in a really good way so that like I can have affordable access to instruments as well, like there's all kinds of good things about it. So I want to be cautious to not be like, oh, it's just the worst and it's ruined things. It's not. But if we only focus on that, then we miss out on other stuff. And so when you talked about how Pibroch is valuable, but so is the rest of the music, that
absolutely.
was like it was a relief to hear somebody say that, I guess.
Like I say, I can't remember when I first sort of realised it.
Mm.
Maybe 50 years ago. But the whole idea of the big feast days was a party.
Yeah, yeah.
People let their hair down. I mean, from some of the accounts that we got, I mean, there's some quite remarkable behaviour that was going on in public. But,
Well, there had to be, or it wasn't a party, right?
well, yeah, I mean, and part of that might have been tied up in the idea that the earlier kind of fertility aspects of religion um,
Mm,
would lead towards what would what was definitely seen by Christians as unacceptable behaviour. But
hmm
that whole communal thing and the whole thing about dance in particular. I mean, dance. I'm not in any way a historian of dance, and I don't think but some of the dances that I suspect are as old as the stories, and
mm.
they would need music. I mean, I don't know if you've ever done it, but when we do Halloween, sorry, New Year, we all cross hands, we sing
Oh,
and we come in and we come.
yeah.
That is potentially a phenomenally old tradition, and it needed tunes.
Well, you know what, Stuart? I've done that once in my life, and it was with my neighbors who are Scottish, who grew up in Scotland. So there you go.
So if you think about it, that is a very, very old kind of
Mm,
way of doing things, and it needed tunes. So and
mm,
those tunes, all of this, the cultural enhancement that comes from all of this is incredibly enjoyable. It's a lot of fun and it's wonderful, but it also has this psychologically cohesive aspect.
mm.
And so I don't think of the Kill Bay as in any way, less important than Hebrew. I think
Yeah.
every bit is significant.
Well, and I try to be aware too that like a lot of that might be hangups that I have created in my own head. I'm not necessarily being told that. It might entirely be me, and I just need to break free of that way of thinking. But I wonder, were you kind of? I might have kind of cut you off, Stuart. Were you kind of moving toward the idea that that like the versions of Pibroch that we have, there was the Pibroch Society that kind of wrote down the Bible of Pibroch,
Yeah,
and you were mentioning that like it's variation, right? There's the ground, and then there's a variation and variation and variation, and that like it's all improvisation. Is that kind of where you were driving there before I
it has to have been.
mm.
I think
But then we get one person's or one version of the improv written down, and then we revere that, don't we?
this is
Yeah.
perhaps, but then this is. I've been trying to find out a way of describing this, and recently, partially because of all the political stuff we're going through here, I've been thinking about it as imperialist thinking. I'm not sure that that's exactly correct, and I thought patriarchal. That's not correct either. It's got something to do with not just an overly academic approach, but an academic approach that in Western culture has been far too focused on classical origins.
Hmm.
And because of that, we have been far too loath to look at what actually our own culture has. And I mean, in Scottish terms, our culture has been deliberately suppressed, as the bagpipes were. There's been a
Hmm.
lot of that in the rest of it. But there are aspects to this that literally are incredible fun. And one of the real fun aspects of this, and this has been cropping up for, ooh, 15 years. I think the first guy who brought it to public notion was a Canadian called Ed Furlong on one of the radio programs in Canada. And he was suggesting that the Odyssey, right, took place in the Hebrides.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I wouldn't rule it out. And I've done
I
that.
mean, I guess they did travel kind of from island to island with different monsters on different islands and stuff like that, and
No,
lots of dangerous areas and rocks and such. Hmm.
and we've got, the best whirlpool candidate for Sir Charybdis. It did take him 7 years to get home. And the
Hmm.
reality that it took him 7 years to sail across the Aegean. Ah, no. So it's like, but then again, there are aspects when you start looking at indigenous culture in any place, obviously in Scotland, that you find out there's so much that has been not just catalogued and categorized, but so much has been fitted into boxes that it doesn't go into. Exactly the same way as the fight thing got constricted by the army. But then, since it broke out, I think it's an entirely different thing. Since it broke free of the shackles of the British Army.
Mm. Stuart, maybe this is like the silliest non-insight that a non-expert has ever made. Maybe it's also at the same time, maybe it's so ridiculously obvious it's not worth asking. But that goddess figure, who in some versions has one eye, one tooth, one leg, how would you spell her name?
Caillech.
Hmm. See, I'm no philologist. I'm not an etymologist. I don't know these things, but it just, I mean, I just thought, what about that Calypso character who's also referred to as Circe? Her name is sometimes Circe.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that close enough that you could squint and go, "Hmm, did she stop Odysseus on his way home? Was she the
Well,
one who got hold of him?"
it's I do delve into some of these very esoteric areas,
Hmm.
and one of the things you have to be careful about, because of the nature of the teaching I've been doing for so long, and I tell people you've got to be so critical of history. Remember that no one ever writes without an agenda. Figure out
Sure.
figure out what the person's agenda is before you make up your mind whether you're going to believe them or not. All of that, and the same is true of story. You've got to be critical.
Hmm.
You can't say, oh, look, because the number of times I've had people go, oh, look at that, could this be that? Well, no, actually, it can't, because that,
Yeah.
didn't come into existence till, 1923. Uh,
Sure, yeah.
you have to be very careful about these things. You have to have an open mind, but you also have to be critical. You know,
So an open mind, but not so open your brain falls out or something like that, huh?
so people get enthusiastic, and people can get so enthusiastic that it completely and utterly, ruins their judgment.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Stuart, I just looked up and realized I've taken over an hour and a half of your day already.
It's been
My
great.
intention was to keep it tighter than that.
No,
Maybe we should start thinking about how to bring it to a graceful close of some kind here. I was thinking, let's see. Well, we were talking about Odysseus traveling through the water, possibly the Hebrides, and we've got a couple of stories in this Pipers in the Supernatural that have to do with water creatures.
yeah,
There's the mermaid and the piper. Um,
that,
there's also the story of why seals have no ears.
was,
Those are both water creatures.
that is a perfect example of
Mm,
how story doesn't have to be too serious.
yeah.
The stuff you're dealing with is based on mythology and helping to understand the worlds. But this is just simply a powerful woman fed up of her son going off to play the pipes, and basically comes storming in one day when he's playing on the beach and casts a spell so as that everyone listening will lose their ears. And the only people listening to him were seals. So seals have no ears. I mean, it's
Well, and I love it because then anybody hears that story, then the next time they're on the beach and they see a seal and they go, huh, no ears.
yeah,
I know exactly why.
that is one of the aspects of story that is
Mm,
difficult to lose, difficult to to always remember, and that is that story does have to be entertaining, because if it's not entertaining, it's
mm.
it has to be. But sometimes it is just entertainment. It's not always significant.
Well, I wonder, Stuart, if maybe that's the perfect line to actually go out on. That, at the end of the day,
Yeah,
stories need to be entertaining, and sometimes that's all there is to it.
yeah, absolutely.
Why the seals have no ears. At Hohowdy on North Uist, there lived a widow with just one son. Now, he had a liking for the pipes, and at every chance was off playing them. But, as he was her only son, the widow was always on him to be helping with the croft or to be out in the boat fishing. His head was full of the piping, however, and he had little love for the hard work that it took to keep the croft going. All the neighbors thought the lad had the markings of a fine player and had encouraged him from the start. This upset his mother, and, as she was reckoned locally to be a powerful witch, nobody wanted to cross her. So, one by one, the neighbors stopped asking the young lad in for a play. Pretty soon he had nobody at all to be playing to. So he would wander off to the shore, and there he would play his bagpipes to the only audience he could find, the seals. Now, everybody in the islands knows that seals love music, and will come whenever it's played. The seals were lucky in this case, for indeed the lad was a braw piper, but they didn't know what they were letting themselves in for. The lad's mother was getting angrier by the day with the fact that, any chance he could, her son would slip off from her sight. She resolved to find out where he was going. She knew fine well that she had frightened off all the neighbors, but thought that maybe one of them was trying to get one over on her by supporting her son. One day, when he thought she wasn't looking, he slipped out of the croft house with his pipes. He had done this 100 times before, and headed straight to the beach. His mother, though, had been keeping an eye open for just this sort of thing, and she followed him out of the house in time to see him head off towards the shore to the south. Keeping her distance, she went after him. After a little while, she heard the bagpipes starting up. Cold, black fury filled her heart. Just wait, she thought to herself, just wait. I'll teach you to encourage this feckless lad of mine, whoever you are. She could hear the pipes getting louder as she approached the beach, keeping low. When she reckoned she was close enough, she stood up, pointing her right forefinger, ready to curse anyone there listening to her son. but there was not a human to be seen. Instead, there were hundreds and hundreds of seals lying along the beach, all paying rapt attention to the fine pipe music they were hearing. Using all her power, she shouted, "Stop!" And even over his pipes her son heard it. He took the pipes from his lips and turned to see his mother standing above him, pointing her finger. "You, get to the peats this instant and gather our fuel, you useless gomrel!" she cried in a voice that would take no disobedience. The laddie tucked his pipes under his arm and ran past his furious mother towards the peats. He knew fine what her temper was like, and he had no intention of waiting about to catch the edge of her tongue. As he ran off, she turned to the seals assembled along the beach. Raising both her hands, she sang a song of imprecation in an old language long forgotten by all but the witches, but we know yet what she said. "I have had my say, that none should help and that none should hear. Now from this time there is no seal that shall have ears." And that is why to this day seals have no ears.